welcome to LHI's weekly book club. I'm Minnie Menon, and today we put the spotlight on a very, very interesting book, Raya, by Srinivas Reddy, who joins us from Rhode Island in the US. Srinivas, so lovely to have you on the show. And I must say, Raya is a crisp and yet very layered take on a very interesting person in Indian history, which is Krishnadevaraya, the great Vijayanagara Raya, the emperor who took the empire to such great heights. So I congratulate you on the book because it's been quite a journey for you, hasn't it? Through literary history. And before I actually go to your book, I must introduce you properly to our audience because Srinivas has a very interesting background. He's a concert sitarist. He's a professor of religious studies, and he has done his PhD on Krishnadevaraya's epic work, which is Amuktamalada, which is a very interesting work in Telugu by this great emperor of Vijayanagara. And Srinivas has looked at literary history in Sanskrit, in Tamil, in Kannada, and in Telugu, and actually brings about a synthesis of literary traditions, historical traditions, etc., in his book Raya. So it's amazing to see how the various layers come through Srinivas. But I'm going to start by talking about the multiplicity of sources. And the number of accounts that you've taken into consideration while looking at the book. Take us through the world of Krishnadevaraya as it emerged from the accounts.
Well, thank you very much. That was a lovely introduction. Well, in terms of the sources, and I think I might say this explicitly in the book, but the most critical source material we have is actually from the Portuguese, these two Portuguese chroniclers. If we did not have their record of their actual visits to Vijayanagara, and in one case, a direct encounter with Raya himself, we would not have a huge amount of information that we do have. So they're really, I would say, the primary source. And these are the types of sources that historians have generally relied upon, foreign travel accounts, which in another way also kind of, reifies this idea that Indians don't write history. And so, we can't rely on Indians to tell us about Indian history. We need foreign source accounts. And I'm not saying, those foreign sources are not great. They are. I'm saying that, but there are plenty of other types of sources and other ways that Indians have written their own history, or recorded rather their own history, maybe not always in words. So I think those things are important to think about. And so one of the most important sources that I use was, Raya's own kavya that you mentioned, Amuktamalada. This is again, even though scholars might have known that there was a kavya, a grand, class high poetry written by the king, it would not be viewed as a historical source. It's just kind of fictitious imaginations of a king. But when you go and do a deep reading of that thing, there's plenty of historical information embedded within that one kind of needs to extract and recontextualize. So for me, the Portuguese sources were, of course, critical. But bringing in the literary sources was probably, I think, my major contribution that I brought to this study.
That's fascinating. Let's get into the world of Krishnadevaraya, Srinivas, through your readings, because it's an interesting time. And what I like about the way you introduced it is put it in context of what was happening elsewhere in the world. When, the Sistine Chapel was being beautifully done up, when Henry VIII was in power in England. It was a time when the Portuguese came in, and it was before Babur came in the north. So I like the way you introduced Krishnadevaraya as one of the first great emperors of the modern world, because he was dealing with trade negotiations, foreign relations, strategic alliances, all the stuff that modern day leaders deal with. So take us through the world as it emerged.
Well, you said it exactly right. He's at this really fascinating moment. I think, 1500, and I've talked about this in other places. People talk about these axial ages, like in 500 BC, there was all these kind of connections, Pythagoras and Buddha and Confucius. Same kind of thing I feel is happening, 2000 years later in 1500. Like, it's a really critical moment. And the interesting part is it's not at the kind of peak of something. It's at these transition moments. It's like at a cusp of something's about to happen, or something is kind of changing, or in a decline, and another thing is on the rise. So like you said, this is before the big Mughal Empire has come into play in South Asia, and yet it's also the time when the Portuguese, within a very short amount of time, have really ensconced themselves in not only India but the entire Indian Ocean coastal network. They pretty much controlled that by around 1510. So. And Goa being a really critical point. So you have the Portuguese, you have all the sultans of the Deccan, you have, like you were mentioning, the Gajapati on the East Coast. So you have Hindu kings, Muslim kings, Christian kings, every type trade going on. The other big part, from a literary cultural perspective, is this is when this vernacular trend in Indian literature and Indian sciences in general, I could say, shastras, was really kind of coming to a peak, when Sanskrit was not always the only language that people wanted to write poetry in, or even shastras in. The regional languages were coming about, and they're kind of reaching a peak at this point too. And what you see is actually a return to some of the older Sanskrit stuff, to look back at that now and kind of revise it, to refurnish it in a new way. And so basically it's just a fascinating moment in history. And a lot of things kind of go in a new direction after this period.
For our viewers, it's very interesting, but I didn't know this. In the 1500s, Vijayanagara was one of the most populous cities in the world. And this is according to an international, analysis of how cities evolved over various centuries. But coming back to this, it's a period of great nuances, Srinivas, and I think you brought that out. But it's such a pity that now, when we look back at that period, it's very hardened the views on that period in India, within India. So there are two ways of looking at it. You spoke about traditional sources. The two ways of looking at traditional sources in India has been either ignore it, saying that, hey, it's just, eulogies of kings, and it's really not worth, looking at historically. Or on the other hand, embrace it so fully that you lose perspective, you see, of what is real. So I think you kind of looked at it with a critical point of view, which is great. It's also a very interesting read because it identifies the real politic of that period. It has been perceived or interpreted as a period of this great Hindu empire versus the combination of the Deccan sultanates after the Brahmanis split up. But it is not really about a Hindu-Muslim divide, as you rightly point out. It's far more complex. So politically, take us through what, in fact, if your book is, what I go with, a large part of his battles were with the Gajapatis of Kalinga and wresting the control of the southern Andhra piece into the Vijayanagara Empire.
Exactly. And I try to bring this point home, and, it's a little bit of a sensitive subject. And I'll be honest, I've gotten a lot of criticism from, different types of people saying, you can't write this kind of thing. But the honest thing is, if you just read the sources, if you actually learn history, the truth will be pretty clear that, as you said, it's much more complex than Hindu versus Muslim. As you mentioned, the largest campaign and the most inimical kind of position he has to any of his enemies is against this Gajapati, who is a Hindu king. And of course, some of at least in the kind of Telugu imagination and the folk imagination of this relationship, it has a lot to do with caste issues, because, the Gajapatis claims himself to be this very, Suryavamshi, Pakka Kshatriya guy, whereas Raya is supposed to be a Dasiputra and not born to any kind of a royal lineage. And so there's that issue going on. And maybe this was something that affected him more personally than any kind of antagonism he might have had towards the sultans and these Muslim kings. So the picture is complex. The largest battles and the longest campaign was definitely against the Gajapati, not against the sultans. He did, of course, fight battles with the sultans, and that's clearly evidenced. What people often say is, the Battle of Talikota that happens after Raya, this is when all the 5 sultans, teamed up and destroyed Vijayanagara. Well, again, that had really not much to do with religion at all. I mean, in many other cases, various other sultans had teamed up with Vijayanagara against another sultan. The issue there was that Vijayanagara just had gotten too powerful. They were so wealthy and so stocked with a huge army that the other, these Bahmani sultans were basically like, we need to get rid of this guy or get rid of this empire because they've become too powerful.
In fact, the prelude to Talikota, which you pointed out, was that less than 50 years before that, Krishnadevaraya had himself marched into Gulbarga and tried to play politics and control the succession battle with the erstwhile Bahmani family. So in many senses, it was a political move. And over there also, what stood out for me is the number of raids that happened, the violence of the raids in both senses, or the fact that idols from one temple were taken to the other or brought back. We've heard that in Kharavella's case much earlier, in Kalinga as well. So this was part of the battle, game that was being played in many senses.
Yeah.
It's really a very complex world out there. But what do you think worked for Krishnadevaraya? Because he was also a visionary in many senses, a man who personified all the great virtues of a king of that period. So it was larger than life, wasn't he?
Yeah, he really was. Well, kind of we were talking earlier. I think one of the really critical things was he was a little bit of an outsider, from the typical mold of here's, your, Kshatriya background and this is what you're going to do and all this stuff. Certainly he had training in all of those. We know that from when we read the sources. And so I feel like there's always an urge for him to kind of live up to this great ideal. And he does. And again, another critical thing I think is he had a very large canvas in his mind about what ruling, what governance, what culture was supposed to be about. And, as we've been talking, he's a great poet. And I think having that poetic kind of vision of the world informed the way that he ruled. I mean, I think of Marcus Aurelius and, people like that, who they're true philosophers, and they were able to bring that kind of artistic philosophical bent into their governance. And I think that really is the key to what made him what he really was.
While cultural or linguistic regional identities were being, crystallized in this period, they hadn't hardened either. Because you have a king who is from Tulu land, which is in South Karnataka, writing in Telugu about a Bhakti saint from Tamil Sangam era. And that's how you describe it. And I'm just using your words. But it's really a very interesting piece. And there isn't this hardening of stance that, I'm a Kannada, you're a Telugu. The things that happen later. So there is far more back and forth happening. How do you explain it?
Exactly. And I think this is kind of explained by, what we were talking about earlier, that 1500. Again, this is when, Telugu literature is really, at its peak, and Kannada, all of these literatures are at their peak. And then it's like 100 or so years after this, like 1600s into the 1700s. That's when the more consolidated regional identities, I think, start getting formed. This is also when Wagner, even in Raya traces a little bit more of kind of a Hindu-Muslim division and antagonism developing that you don't see in the 1500s. So this 1500 moment, it's right before a lot of the kind of distinctions of modern historiography get put into place. So that's why it's super interesting, because it's right before all of it happens, but you can kind of see it happening. So that's why Raya can write even in Telugu is the best language. Now he's saying Telugu is the best language, but he's not saying it from a literary perspective or a linguistic perspective. He's saying it from, again, a political perspective. He was saying that most of my lords were Telugu guys or Telugu speaking people. So that's the language I had to use. So it's not till later that you get now a kind of linguistic identity sense of politics coming into being Telugu or being Tamil or whatever. So I think it's a really critical moment in history to look at, that from like 1500 to 1700, I think really kind of defines that. And maybe that has a lot to do with the rise of the Mughal Empire. I don't know. A much larger influx of various peoples coming into India at that point. I'm not sure. We'd have to, look into it. But it's a good, important question and an important period to look more into.
Let's look at the Amrutamaleda. It's a very interesting work, part poetic and part as you have read into it, a kind of a account that gives you an insight into what were the key concerns of the period, what were the key determinants as a king, etc. So, what can you tell us? Because your earlier book is really a translation of the Amrutamaleda that you did a couple of years back. So tell us what comes through about the king, Krishnadevaraya, through his own work.
Well, there's always the part of any author, as is in their writing. You can't, no matter how, especially with historians or academics who claim like this great sense of objectivity. I mean, yes, we want to be as objective as possible, but we're all in our work and we all have to kind of accept that to a certain level. So that's part of it. The other part is, the translation that I did was mostly of the poetic sections. There is, for example, and this is what I draw on in the Raya book, there's a whole section of Rajaniti, like, some 80 verses where he basically says, this is how you should be a king. And a lot of the verses I quote in the book are from that, which is his basic, instructions about how to be a modern king. Because he's, again, pulling on things from, Kautilya and Arthashastra, but he's updating them and reformulating them to fit, the issues at hand, like, for example, dealing with foreigners like Portuguese who import horses. And he says this directly. So there's a way that he's, at one level, expressing his, again, it's also a religious text. So you have to, read it like, I mean, he was a very devout person. There's no doubt about it. So at one level, you're reading it as this kind of like, devotional text written by a bhakta in a sense. And at the same time, you can slice it another way and see that this is a king trying to tell people, how to behave, and trying to tell other kings how to be a good king. So it's fascinating on multiple levels, and you have to read the text on those multiple levels. And it's not just poetry, like the way it's and this goes to the heart of kind of what my bigger concern is how do we now reinterpret this word history in an Indian context? I mean, it's a major part of what you guys are doing with all these interviews is, live history, live history. History is alive. History is the now. And there's no other civilization that I have seen more so than India that expresses this ability. Like, we live our history, like museums, TK, museums are fine, but they're not really our way. They're not how we ever, record our history, because a museum museumifies something, it fossilizes something, it freezes something, in time, in space, forever. It's there, you go, you visit it, there's a marker. That's not how our monuments are. That's not how our museums are outside. People, even me, sometimes I get frightened. You go to Delhi and you see people just, airing their laundry on some old Mughal monument. I mean, that's, maybe that's not the best thing, but
everything, Srinivas, because we are losing so much so fast that we need to look at every possible way of keeping it together. But thank you for mentioning it. Yes, that's the very idea with which we coined the term live history, because we are the only ancient civilization where the continuum of history is still there in
That's
many,
right.
many different facets. And that's why we talk about it. The other sentence which I feel is not given its due recognition as a source of history are temples, you see, because they are living pilgrimage centers. And the more
Yes.
famous the temple, the more difficult it is for us to really study it as a historic site. What is
Right.
also interesting in your book is the number of inscriptions that you've looked at from Tirupati, the Sri Venkateshwara temple, because Krishnadevaraya was a very, very devout Vaishnavite and bhakt, and he has made multiple pilgrimages to the place and looked at Tirupati for inspiration. So I think that spiritual connect also meant that the kind of pendulum shifted east towards Andhra in many senses, because not only was there a battle, but also a spiritual connect to Krishnadevaraya.
Absolutely, absolutely correct. And we also have to see these temples not only as just spiritual places. They were communal spaces, places of food, places of land, of money. And I mean, the temple was a critical part of all of the South Indian society at that time. And yeah, as you said, Raya visited 7 times, and tons of inscriptions are on those temples talking about, you know, his donations here and there. And then, as I mentioned in the book, I mean, half of those inscriptions are all about the food, because I mean, again, food is so critical. The temple was a place of food distribution. The lands were donated to the temple in order to grow the food. So many people used to get their food from the temple only. So temples have a hugely important social function, and in that sense also start to have a political function too. So the temple as a site of history, not only religious but social and political, is critically important. I think we need to do more research on these things, and not worry actually that, you know, they're still in use, but actually embrace that fact and see that, again, this is another example of how this historical place is still alive. I mean, even the Virupaksha temple, you know, in Hampi, I mean, I did my puja there. I mean, people go and still do prayers there all the time, every day. So that sense of, you know, somehow that this temple is just a religious place where people are doing pujas, is again a limited a sense of what that place encapsulates, and so tons more research. I mean, I saw you guys did all that stuff in Penukonda, for example, like those Jain temples that are there. Nobody knows. I mean, it was a huge site of Jain. That Bhattaraka seat was in Penukonda actually, and this Penukonda, like you were saying, now relating it back, you know, if you look at, you know, you have Vijayanagara up here, Penukonda coming here, Chandragiri here. Chandragiri is right next to Tirupati. Now, this shows basically what happened after Vijayanagara. These guys slowly moving further and further south. You know, Chandragiri and Penukonda were always kind of like summer kind of capitals. But, you know, as Vijayanagara fell, all of that movement goes basically southeast. And then finally, it's in Tanjavur where, you know, the major Nayakas and all of that stuff develop, and that political power reestablish itself in that way. But you're right that there is this kind of move southeast after the fall. So
Right.
very interesting.
Penukonda also is a jail where Timarasu was.
Yeah.
It's so full of stories, and you know, there are people who believe that the great Vijayanagar wealth is buried there. That's a little bit of an aside, because there were some crazy stories about that. But you know,
But see what these crazy stories they have, because like I'm saying, when the Sultan, after Talikota, everybody knew that these guys were going to come to Vijayanagara. So all the royal family and the queens, they grabbed as much of the wealth they could have, and they went to Penukunda.
yeah.
So it's very likely that somewhere there might be some royal treasure buried. We don't know.
I must thank you, because you know, we have shot extensively through you know, Sri Kalahasti, Sri Kakulam, all these areas. And when you were writing about it, I was reading about it, suddenly, you know, brought so many memories. Also Kondapalli, for instance, the great fort over there, and such an important site of control of the southern Andhra belt. So it's very interesting when you add geography, literature, etc., to understand.
Yeah.
But what is also interesting is that you've been critical of Krishnadevaraya also, of what he became afterwards, because there was a little bit of a megalomaniac in him. like you said. And a large part of the later strife was also because he had thought that he had become too powerful. And explain to us where do you see that change coming in the man?
Well, I think, undefeated in battle. Undefeated in battle. I mean, this is not many kings in history anywhere could say that.
And
Even Alexander.
on the front, right? He went for the wars himself, which is also
Yes. Yeah, that's why I mentioned like Alexander. He was like an Alexander type, at the front with his men in battle fighting. And he really was in there in the thick of it. And although, of course, Alexander lost his final battle in India, Raya never lost a battle. And I think, especially defeating the Gajapati, after the Gajapati victory, and after he had reclaimed what was, the traditional Vijayanagara Empire, that is anything south of the Krishna, he basically was like, I ruled this whole thing. I am like, and he really, that kind of arrogance started to grow in him. And then, because the Tungabhadra, which is, Hampi's on Tungabhadra, which is, a little side branch of the Krishna. So then there's a question, who owns that little piece right there?
Raichur is a significant piece because it was at the delta of both, at the crossroads of the Tungabhadra and Krishna. And I think all the battles with the Deccanese Sultanates was around that little piece of land.
That's it.
It's as important as Raichur.
Raichur, Mudgal, all that stuff is in that zone. And so that was like the most hotly contested place. And then after the big battle of Raichur, where he had this resounding victory, I think he felt at that point that this is it. I am the number one. I've defeated all the Gajapatis. Even Bijapur, these great sultans are nobody. And then that's when I say, he crossed a line, because when he'd had that kiss my foot incident, when he told the Bijapur Sultan to come to Vijayanagara and kiss his foot, and then he'd give back whatever he had taken, this really, I think, was it wasn't very diplomatic. It was a little bit not like his other actions, but we can see that, it had gone to his head. I think the victories had gone to his head. The wealth, the splendor, the everything, the adulation from the people, all of it, the great, glorious, kind of palaces that he had constructed, the tanks. So I think basically he had grown a little too arrogant, and issue, and, statements like that, or like claims like that. And then, like you said, the rather devastating march that he made into Sultan territory, that all was a huge blow to all the Bahmani sultans. And that probably really, angered them and wanted them to seek revenge.
And that was a devastating move up north also, because what is also interesting, and another tantalizing question that history poses to us, is what if he had gone beyond? And he had all ambitions to go beyond. It would have been so interesting, because the north was in flux. And I often wonder, what if he had marched on beyond Golconda and beyond the Gulbarga? It would have been a very interesting time.
Yep, it would have been.
But it didn't happen. But then, from this height of power, this great success, the end of Krishnadevaraya was also quite an anticlimax, Srinivas, because he comes back. He's not very old from what you portrayed. He's got a young child. He puts him on the throne. He's very worried. He has a falling out. And his son-in-law plays a very pivotal role later in the Battle of Talikota as well. But this is a sad end to a great king, right?
Yes. And these again are stories. We don't have even that Timarasu's jail in Penukonda is kind of a story, but these are the stories. Even I mean, this is recorded in the Portuguese chronicles, this incident, and then of course in the oral Chatu tradition of Andhra, even Karnataka, all of this is a well-known story. And again, I think it has to do with this kind of blinded, not to use that word, but this blinded sense of what was going on with his pride that had grown so much, and this desire to have his son be there. And also, it's very clear that this son-in-law, Raya, who, talk about another fascinating character. I mean, this is a man who used to fight for Bijapur, and made his way back to Vijayanagara, and kind of ingratiated himself into the royal family and married Raya's daughter, and then basically put this puppet king in place, and then basically deposed him soon after, and then basically led the empire to ruin. But this Raya certainly had some machinations at hand at the court, and probably Raya in his pride and his kind of whatever didn't see that, and his mind became poisoned, and he believed the accusations against Timurasu, the man, like I said, that he saw as he called him Appaji, the man that basically was like a father to him, who raised him, who supported him his entire life. And this is the man that he has blinded. It's so sad. But I think it's part of the myth. A good myth needs some kind of tragedy. It can't just be all happy, wonderful the whole time. There has to be some kind of sadness and kind of angst in it. And I think the lesson then of Raya's life is, you can't let these things go to your head, that you have to kind of keep it under control. And then again, not to bring back Alexander, but Alexander was a good model. I read a lot of biographies of him before I wrote the book. He also had this kind of like pretty sad end, he gets poisoned at the end, he doesn't know what's going on. So these kind of meteoric rise of these great kings also, and sometimes in a meteoric crash also. And so I think, again, the lesson of Raya is, it's good to be proud and make these great achievements, but to keep them at check as much as possible and not let them get out of control.
Important lesson through history, isn't it, Srinivas? And we keep repeating it. At least
we do.
Yeah. Tell me, I want to ask you this question. I don't know whether you have an answer for it, but I'm amazed that a man celebrated a legend, a man who's left such a great body of work behind. He's something of a myth around him, etc. And yet it took a Colin Mackenzie in 1800 to discover the ruins of Hampi. I can't, understand how a great capital like that kind of fell off the radar. It wasn't celebrated. I know the devastation was terrible after the Battle of Talikota. But have you thought of this question? What comes to your mind?
Well, I think it relates back to this question. I don't think the people ever forgot about him. I think if you went around, in 1800 and asked people who's Krishnadevaraya, they would tell you all these same stories of how he did all these great things, and how he blinded his minister at the end of his life. I think those stories, those memories, that again is the Indian history. Maybe we forgot about the buildings, or didn't care about them, or maybe as they still are. I mean, most people just go and herd their cattle there, which is why I love the back picture of the book. Just that beautiful picture of the cow herder, or the buffalo herder. So again, I think we also have to realize that as Indians, we have our history given to us through a British lens and through a Western lens many times. What we even think of our own selves is derived through that. So, and a lot of, again, there's, this is a big topic to discuss, and it's sensitive too, but, like the intellectuals of India, the people that read books, well, that's what we do. We read books. So the first thing we need to do is, okay, you go look it up, Vijayanagara, and then you find out that Robert Sewell wrote a book, or Mackenzie discovered some monuments. But someone in the village, let us say, who maybe not even be literate, certainly not in English, that guy might have been hearing some Burakathas or some Harikathas or whatever that were telling stories about Krishnadevaraya. And that person might have a whole other imagination about Vijayanagara that's totally alive and real. And he might say, I never forgot anything. You might have forgotten, but I never forgot.
And that's why the work that you've done is so interesting, because you've gone into the literary sources of the works that Krishnadevaraya himself did, literary sources written later. And I think that's the beauty of it. When you look at regional literature, when you look and correlate the accounts, because every account says as you said, is a perspective. It's not the final account. And I think,
Yeah.
and kudos to you for the work that you've done. Really look forward to more stuff, Srinivas, with you. And we must do a lot of work together, because I think it's fascinating to see the.
Can I just?
Yes,
Sorry.
yes.
I just want to add one thing. I didn't mean to, like, preserving monuments or something is not important. I think that's also very, very important. Archaeology is very important. Historical writing that's done in the West is very important. But it should be done alongside listening to these stories, listening to people's accounts, listening to people's memories. I feel like all of that is history. And if we can take all of that into account, we have this like holistic picture of what Indian history can really be, and hopefully how we can teach the world how history can really be, a different type of discipline than it currently is.
Right, absolutely. It's the number of perspectives that come together to help us understand events and people. Thank you so much, Srinivas, for joining us.
Thank you.
It's lovely talking to you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.